Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth. This program features in-depth conversations with the leading names in the subjects of UFOs, abductees, the paranormal, panel discussions, and the very best and brightest of the next generation of writers and researchers. Meanwhile Here on Earth, the show breaking new ground in alternative talk with your intrepid host, veteran investigative writer and researcher, Peter Robbins.
And welcome back. And it is true. The show is Meanwhile Here on Earth, broadcasting live. Yes, this is no podcast. This is actually happening right now. We are on KUNX, digital broadcasting as always. And we're going to get right to tonight's guest, who I've been looking forward to having on this show and talking about some matters that are deeply embedded in my lives and the lives of most people who have been touched by Western culture. Arlen Schumer, MFA, creates award-winning comic book-styled illustrations for the advertising and editorial markets and is one of our foremost historians of comic book art. Comic Book Artist magazine named him one of the most articulate and enthusiastic advocates of comic book art in America, end quote. His coffee table book, The Silver Age of Comic Book Art, won the Independent Publishers Award for Best Popular Culture Book, and ABC TV's 2020 called him one of the country's preeminent authorities on comics and culture. He lectures and produces webinars on these and other pop culture subjects, and among other things, we will be discussing his books Visions from the Twilight Zone and the 5 Themes of the Twilight Zone tonight. And Arlen Schumer, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Peter.
A pleasure. And you were a great sport in jumping in at the last minute. I normally book fairly ahead, and I know from also being called shortly before shows where they need somebody quickly. Thank you again for more than filling the void that would have been here tonight. I want to begin where I begin with a lot of guests, which is a question that's driven me since childhood and often informs this show, which is, how do people in public life become the people they are? Growing up amidst pop culture here in America, it's kind of easy to understand why somebody would go into that as a profession. However, I'm sure as a baby, that's not what you were thinking of doing. Can you tell us a little about your childhood and your family and your exposure to comic books and other aspects of pop culture early on?
Well, since we're going to talk about the Twilight Zone, you mentioned my first book, Visions from the Twilight Zone. It's the only coffee table art book about the show. It came out in 1990 from Chronicle Books. It's a hardcover. And in it, I treat the images from the Twilight Zone like black and white art photography. Yeah. And the dialogue and narration, I typeset to read like poetry. It's the only book of its kind. It was done, when there was only one show about the Twilight Zone. But look at what happens when you take off the book cover. You see the eyeball in outer space? I embossed on the hardcover. Peter, that's the first image I can recall seeing as a child. I had to be 4.5 years old, sitting in front of a black and white television set sometime in 1963, when that black eyeball graphic opening for the Twilight Zone debuted. Yeah. That's the first image I saw as a child.
Wow.
And then, 32 years later, it winds up on the cover of my book, paying homage to those early Twilight Zone experiences I grew up with the show through reruns, like generations have grown up with it ever since it debuted 65 years ago this year. October was the 65th anniversary of the show's debut. And it's also Rod Serling's centennial this year. Nice Jewish boy born on Christmas Day.
In Binghamton, New York.
Yeah, well, he born in Syracuse, but raised in Binghamton, his adopted hometown.
I am one of those people who, as a kid, was old enough to stay up late enough at that time in the golden age of TV with parents who were wonderfully open-minded. And I think this is going to be the kind of show where we both go off on tangents at times. There's that wonderful moment in Back to the Future where Marty McFly is staying at the home of his future mother who has eyes on him, a wonderfully Freudian moment in American film history. And they wheel in the TV, watch while they're having dinner, and it's the Honeymooners.
Yeah.
And he reacts by saying, "Oh, I saw this one again. It's a great rerun." And the younger brother says, "What's a rerun?" I thought the concept didn't exist. And seeing those episodes as a kid for the first time without any reference to anything else except a lot of cowboy shows and, earlier shows, it was a revelation. It spurred my interest in reading. It was so visionary at times in the sense that episodes of Star Trek made such an impact on our culture. I can't compare it to many other shows, but I don't know if there would have been a Star Trek without.
Roddenberry gave the eulogy at Serling's funeral in 1975 when he died at 50 years old from all those cigarettes he smoked. And Roddenberry said in his eulogy, and I'm paraphrasing, that Star Trek would have only been a glimmer in his eye if it hadn't been for the trails that Serling blazed in the Twilight Zone. I mean, if you look at the diversity casting of Star Trek, which it's known for, well, Serling is the one that broke ground with that. He cast a black actor in a dramatic role in 1960 at a time where there were no black actors on TV in dramatic roles at all. Women in strong, independent roles, not comedians or domesticated housewives.
Well, wasn't the pilot episode the one with Elizabeth Montgomery and
No, that was the opening of season 3.
Oh, okay. And Charles Bronson.
Yes.
But yes, strong roles for women always. That Agnes Moorehead, the Invaders episode, is still one of the most memorable pieces of television, in great part because there's no dialogue.
Yes.
But
and wheezing.
Going through the PDF version of your book, I got more and more involved. First,
my old book. There's my new book of about the best Twilight Zone episodes.
I guess you've even gotten better since then. But there is something when you are faced with a writer who is not only passionate about their subject, but sensitive to the nuances of it, and who really enjoys taking you into the parts that they enjoy. And you walk that line between being very scholarly at times and at other times just a real page turner. And I had forgotten, if I ever knew, how many important writers Serling took and not only presented their work, but extraordinary rewrites of their work. And how many of the actors that we were introduced to went on to not just become American icons, but Academy Award winners and some of the most enduring actors of the 20th and 21st century. Also, his life and how events in his life, like all great writers, affected his work. Any episode that had anything to do with World War II, most of, my attention as a kid contemplating that was focused on Europe. But what that man saw and went through in the South Pacific affected him deeply, as it would any combat veteran. But the way it came up in some of the episodes was way beyond their time, in no uncertain terms.
Are you asking me a question? Because you just rattled off 6 topics without giving me a chance to respond to any one of them, Peter. I mean,
It's not. It can be a challenging interview style. Choose which one you'd like to jump into. Any? Well, basically, the depth that you cover it with, we see an impact on the world of popular culture, and I actually had so much fun looking at just certain images, key moments in an episode with the title of the episode, and bang, the whole thing would flash back into my head. And in some cases, where I was at the time, it really was television above and beyond, American television at its best. Did you actually start watching episodes at 4.5 or so? Or were you older when you started to actually watch it?
well, like I said, I grew up with it on reruns and never forgot it. Some of those episodes, like the one with the pig faces, Eye of the Beholder. I mean, if you saw that as a kid, it burned its way into your brain forever.
Yeah.
So the Twilight Zone is as much a part of my childhood and growing up as the Batman TV show or, what was happening in the 60s and so much else. The comic books I was reading, the superheroes, knowing that I was going to become an artist at a young age and just growing up with all that great pop culture. But the Twilight Zone always had a special place, and I just never forgot it. And then it seemed to have disappeared, I feel, for a bunch of years there, circa late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah.
But then I think I grew up in the New York area, in northern New Jersey. And then I think it came back in reruns on one of the local regional New York City stations. And that was when I was a teenager. So then I grew up with it all over again. And like I said, I would imagine that's true for a lot of generations. They grow up with it now through the marathons that are on every New Year's Eve. And thank God for those that kept the show alive. But it was when I was in art school, Rhode Island School of Design in the late 70s, that video art was just coming into vogue. Yeah. Artists were manipulating the TV image to get all matter of abstract patterns and taking photographs of the screen and presenting that in galleries as art. And I remember looking at that and going, I bet you if I took pictures of these great Twilight Zone episodes, because the black and white look of the show always appealed to me as an artist, especially. It was like film noir on television, the high contrast black and white. So when I got into art school in the late 70s, that was just when black and white art photography was coming into vogue. I think the Museum of Modern Art didn't establish a photography department until 1975. So I was keenly aware of black and white photography. Born to Run, the album cover came out in 75. Patti Smith's Horses, that black and white look. But I always felt the Twilight Zone, if you were flipping around the TV dial, there were other black and white shows like I Love Lucy and The Honeymooners. The Twilight Zone had a look that was unique amongst all black and white TV shows. They're not all created equal. It had a consistent director of photography, George Clemens, who direct descendant, by the way, of Samuel Clemens.
Perfect.
And he won an Emmy for his work on the Twilight Zone. It had that black and white look. And I remember thinking, if artists are taking pictures of abstract TV images, I bet you if I took pictures of Twilight Zone episodes and treated them as black and white art photography, they would look just as cool. And that eventually became my first book, Visions. But I had always been writing about the episodes themselves. It started out 30 years ago as capsule descriptions. And over time, I would elaborate on those descriptions. And eventually, when I finally realized I could pull together a book, that became my new book, The 5 Themes of the Twilight Zone, which is me writing essays about 68 out of the 156 episodes.
And we're going to be talking about those 5 themes. But as you were talking, I realized that as somebody that grew up with an appreciation for black and white photography and black and white films and silent films that were on television in the late 1950s, the early 60s, that I watched in part with my grandfather, I really lost interest in the television show The Twilight Zone when it went to color. I couldn't tell you anything about a single episode.
Remakes in 85 and another. Yeah, listen, all the remakes of The Twilight Zone suck. They're all shot in color, which misses the point. The Twilight Zone was a black and white concept. The middle ground between light and shadow, as Serling described.
Yes.
People on the verge of reality and unreality, life and death. Those are very black and white concepts.
Yes.
So all the remakes, beginning with Spielberg's 1983 film, have been shot in color, and I dismissed it immediately. There was the remake in 85. There was another syndicated version, I think, in the year 2000. Recently, they gave it to Jordan Peele, the writer-director, and 2 seasons of 10, 1-hour episodes. I thought they all sucked. There's only one Twilight Zone, and that's Rod Serling's original. That's it.
Agreed. Serling settled, he stayed in central New York State. Was it Inverness that he settled in toward the end of his life? Where was he living the last years of his life when he was affiliated with Ithaca College?
Well, he was still in California, living in the Pacific Islands. He had a summer home in Lake Cayuga, I think.
Okay.
It said Cayuga Productions. But I'm not sure about details like that. I'm concerned with Rod Serling, one of the greatest writers of the 20th century, not just television writers. I claim that he should be considered as one of our greatest writers of the 20th century that he's not given the credit for.
Did he win an Emmy for Requiem for a Heavyweight?
Yes, that was one of 3 Emmys he won 3 years in a row in the mid-50s. Patterns, Requiem for a Heavyweight, and The Comedian. Those 3 Emmys from 55 to 58 are what gave him the creative clout to go out to LA to do The Twilight Zone. So if it wasn't for that creative clout, he was the only creative person in charge of a TV show in 1959. What we now call a showrunner.
Yes.
Creative people in charge. Serling was the first, but he was more than a showrunner. He owned the show. And that's why he attracted such incredible creative talent. Not just the who's who of Hollywood actors and up-and-coming actors. Everybody in Hollywood wanted to work with Serling because they knew he was a creative person in charge who would allow them to be creative. The music by Bernard Herrmann, who was doing all of Hitchcock's soundtracks.
Yes.
Why did he deign to do a TV show soundtrack and continue through the 5 years of the Twilight Zone's network run doing original soundtracks for individual episodes?
And they made a difference.
Bernard Herrmann, because it was Rod Serling. And that's why these episodes stand the test of time, because he was a creative person letting other creative people, the directors, the actors, the set designers, everybody involved to do their best work because they were doing it for a creative person. He was like Orson Welles of television, really, Rod Serling.
Because the writing was so superior and the casting and the quality of the actors, we had kind of a golden circle around that show in a way, in that all you needed was your imagination and sitting in front of that TV, because when you think about it, physically, those shows were so embarrassingly inexpensive to produce. You get a location or 2, you get costumes. Special effects really didn't enter into it that much. The special effects were all going on in our head.
Well, exactly. I mean, in some of the greatest episodes, like Walking Distance, in which a man literally walks back in time and meets himself as a child, one of Serling's most autobiographical episodes, recently voted the greatest single episode of The Twilight Zone, not just greatest time travel episode. Greatest I call it the Citizen Kane of television. It was the fifth episode that aired. The point I want to make about it is there are no special effects. The screen doesn't go wavy when he goes back in time. It's done so creatively by shooting through a series of mirrors like Alice through the looking glass. Yeah. And that's why The Twilight Zone, you know, there were a handful of episodes that tried to do monsters with special effects. They're cheesy. You know, The Outer Limits, which came after The Twilight Zone, was all about the monster of the week. And if you look at those shows, and sorry if I'm offending any Outer Limits fans out there, but the monsters were ridiculous looking. Whenever The Twilight Zone did monsters, they were just as ridiculous. The greatest episodes are ones that work on your imagination, the dimension of imagination.
Yes.
Horror, fantasy, science fiction are all about the mind. Yeah. And that's what Serling brought to television. Science fiction in the 50s were giant monsters and bugs and radioactive this and that. It wasn't taken seriously by Hollywood. It was considered a junk medium for teenagers. And they weren't adapting great science fiction novels from the earlier part of the 20th century. Science fiction was a clique of writers in Southern California. It wasn't, it was looked down upon by American literature critics as a junk medium. But Serling, who loved science fiction and fantasy and horror, he took it seriously. Yeah. He loved science fiction and all that. And that's why he wanted to bring serious science fiction to this relatively new medium of filmed half-hour anthology television.
Yes.
Which had never been done as well before The Twilight Zone and has never been done as well since.
It hasn't.
For the perfect moment in time. And that's what was the achievement of The Twilight Zone. It didn't invent science fiction. It didn't introduce things like female robots. It introduced it to television, which was a whole new medium. You know, some of his greatest episodes were adaptations. Serling was a master adapter of, you know, prose short stories into half-hour television episodes. That's why they give Oscars the best adapted screenplay. There's an art to adapting. Out of the, I think, 41 episodes of Serling's that I write essays about, a dozen of them are adaptations. And in fact, Peter, some of the most beloved episodes of The Twilight Zone, like the Burgess Meredith, where he breaks his glasses on the library steps, Time Enough at Last, which everybody remembers, right?
Yeah, you bet.
That wasn't a Serling original. It was a Serling adaptation, which is why I believe the reason why we remember that episode is because of the cruelty of the ending. You know, the storyteller manipulated us to loving Henry Bemis. Yes. And by breaking his glasses, that is a worldview that is very pessimistic and cruel, but it's not Serling's worldview. He faithfully adapted a short story by Lynn Venable. I believe if it was a Serling original, Peter, it would have ended with the Burgess Meredith character reading his books on those library steps as the camera pulls away, leaving him happily ever after. That would have been Serling's worldview.
At the same time, to be challenged enough, to be secure enough in your talent, in your self-image in the world, to choose to adapt works that you're not totally in sync with. You are giving the audience the benefit of a collaboration that would have never existed before, and a collaboration, again, based on a certain dynamic tension, not, oh, goody, this ends just like I want. And let's talk, well, without being complete spoilers, so many of the endings were whiplash-like or extremely, they just turned your half-hour world upside down.
And again, Serling didn't invent the twist ending. It comes from O. Henry,
True.
the writer. Alfred Hitchcock Presents had twist endings that precede Twilight Zone. But I think Serling perfected the twist ending because we remember the twist endings of the Twilight Zone episodes more than we remember any Alfred Hitchcock episode or O. Henry's story, I would maintain.
That chronologically, do you remember the wonderful show Science Fiction Theater with our host Truman Bradley? Did that predate?
Yeah, that precedes me. I don't know that.
It was. I thought that was a very thoughtful show and had a real gravitas to it that a kid could feel, a little more adult. That this was something being put forward to grown-ups. But
well, again, this was on CBS television, The Twilight Zone.
Yeah.
Like anything truly groundbreaking, it's made up of elements that previously existed. Like I said, Serling didn't invent the twist ending. He didn't invent anthology television, but he perfected it with these half-hour Twilight Zone episodes.
Yeah. You mentioned Citizen Kane earlier in a wonderful context, but every technique and every seemingly original shot was there. Wells brought it all together and then added some. And that overriding talent, it's one of the reasons I was such a fan of Law and Order for so long. Dick Wolf, the original showrunner after, in a sense, Serling, he was in charge of every aspect of production. And when you have somebody that's smart and talented who knows how to delegate responsibility, you've got it. Again, so many of those locations were so simple, but the stories weren't. And also for a child, the theme of death comes up regularly, or near death, or, well, being in the Twilight Zone to one degree or another, and opened up my thinking of the beyond. Also, as somebody that had no interest in UFOs at that time, there were so many episodes looking back on it that were really thoughtful meditations on interfacing of civilizations, panic around the unknown regarding aliens, for lack of a more descriptive term, some that were incredibly poignant. And every once in a while, one that was so deeply and warmly humorous. The one with Buster Keaton traveling forward in time, the inventor, and going from the world of silence to New York City with a lot of noise. It was just a masterpiece. Again, I was up late last night reading through these descriptions, and each one of them triggering more memories about the different shows. And what I'd like to do, because I had never even thought of the 5 components or the 5 aspects of the show that I now had that kind of moment last night. Well, of course, but had never thought of them as such. Again, the book cover, and folks can, we'll go over all your contact information. Folks can actually buy signed copies of this from you. Of course, it's available, on Amazon, or I would hope folks go to the local bookstores. But very briefly, this, what we talked about, and not to forget something that we will get to, but right now we're in the Twilight Zone. And an extraordinary illustrator we'll be talking about more in the second hour. But to start with, as somebody that also is an art school graduate, the School of Visual Arts, where I was taught also for many years, I have a background in design and absolutely loved the layout of your books.
Right.
It's such a difference when you have somebody who really knows, understands, and appreciates the dynamic tension you can set up on a page, other than the words themselves, which can be plenty.
I tried to get the feeling of a black and white television show on a black and white printed page. And I typeface that the Twilight Zone titles were originally set in, called Bernhard Modern for you font aficionados.
Okay. That's great. You can probably find it in your typefaces. Also, that it gives you things that are short to read or, more traditional reading. And this is a good example here on this page, quoting, "What Serling created above all else was a homegrown vernacular of alienation, identify slippage and paranoia, and he did it right. He did it right when it most needed doing. When his audience was starved for a vocabulary to express their uneasiness, and he did it on weekly television." That's another thing that's hard to contemplate. These pioneers, and I'm more familiar with it from stories about Sid Caesar or Gleason, people that had to get live shows on every week. And these were filmed, but they had to be done at quite a rate. I can only imagine what their production schedule was like when the show was really, going at its fastest pace. Obsolete Man. And what, again, starting with science and superstition. That's so innate, part of it to the human condition. That wrestling match between fear of the unknown and empirical evidence. And that plays a real part in the show. Can you give us a good example of an episode where these forces are facing us?
Well, I might as well start with the very first episode of The Twilight Zone. Where is it? That starred Earl Holliman, who just recently passed away at the age of 96. But it's all about a man who finds himself alone in a deserted American town somewhere in California, looks like. You can see the mountains, but he doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know how he got there.
Yeah.
That is the essence of alienation, which became a very trendy phrase in post-war, American psychology. We were alienated from our reality after the atom bomb dropped. That is between science and the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge, as Serling described The Twilight Zone. That's when the atom bomb was hanging over everybody's heads.
Yeah.
And the idea of being alone, isolated from reality, it's what we all go through in our individual realities. We often feel apart and isolated.
Arlen, that was the very first episode?
The very first episode, October 2nd, 1959. Now, I consider it not only a great pilot episode, because in it, you'll find what I say, whatever you love about The Twilight Zone, there's something in that first episode. He gets confused with mannequins and real people. Just everything that happens to this guy in that half hour. And the surprise ending is still 65 years later, unable to be guessed at ahead of time. If you know what I call the Twilight Zone shtick of the surprise endings, and let's say you show these episodes to a young generation, they might be able to predict some of the twist endings ahead of time. It's not really fair to the Twilight Zone to judge it that way. But I'll tell you something, that first episode, spoiler alert, it turns out he's an astronaut in training in an isolation booth to test if man can withstand being alone in outer space for as long as it would take to take a trip to the moon and back. This was before the Gemini program, obviously. But Serling wrote it right at the dawn of the space age, after the Mercury astronauts were formed in 1958, if you've read the right stuff. And while that is what the plot is about, what it's really about, again, is man's alienation from his reality, which is not only makes it a great pilot episode, but maybe the greatest pilot episode in the history of television, that first episode. And science was the science of the astronaut in training isolation booth. The superstition was what he manufactured inside of his mind during the first half hour of the episode, and by upending reality to the viewer, it had never been really done before like that on television, where what you had been just watching was not the quote reality. It was in his mind. It was the dimension of imagination. It felt real. It looked real. It seemed real, which is what nightmares and dreams are all about. When you're dreaming them, they feel real, but they're not real. Or are they real? Man has been philosophizing and asking questions about the nature of dreams versus reality. And the Twilight Zone had so many great episodes. Yeah. Charles Beaumont, one of the other great writers that wrote Twilight Zone episodes, along with Serling and Richard Matheson, he wrote 2 episodes about the nature of dreams versus reality. Perchance to Dream from season 1 and Shadow Play from season 2, that are the greatest meditations in 25 minutes of philosophical questions that philosophers have been asking each other for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And Serling did it, or Beaumont did it, in 25 minutes.
The second component, as soon as I read it, I flashed on half a dozen episodes. And it's important to remind our viewers where America was at this moment in time. The American dream had translated itself to having a private home in a town somewhere and having things be just so. And the housing development,
Levittown.
The facade, the social facade, if you will, of a civilized neighborhood, the idea of what was going on behind the doors or in the people's minds. And my gosh, well, needless to say, that idea of the suburbs really crept into the reality of so many of these shows. I know we've got, we can see the ones that are listed here, and It's a Good Life. That is one of the great, it's transcended itself to become part of world culture in a way. Dear Billy Mumy, is it Mumy? A wonderful child actor that we all know and many of us grew up with, who is evil incarnate and terrifying. And to give that over to a small child is another theme that runs through some of the darkest horror stories and contemplations of, I think about the wonderful early 60s film, The Village of the Damned, and those wonderful little children. Mumi was truly terrifying in that. But what was the episode where the aliens screw around with, they're on the hillside and driving everybody in the valley kind of crazy? What was the name of that episode?
Monsters Are Due on Maple Street.
Holy shit. That was a grabber as well. I think it really was wonderfully bookended too by the Fallout Shelter, the Survival Shelter episode. Again, that level of paranoia and concern in America at that moment as the Cold War's ratchets were turned up on all of us, and even children knew, especially if you lived, somebody like you or me, living within radiation distance of New York City. That was part of our reality growing up. Hitchcock often dealt with, a man who was innocent but wronged and had no idea, who had accused him or how he had gotten into the situation that he was. It was certainly a theme that Serling dealt with as well. Did you have a favorite episode or episodes within this quadrant of what you're talking about here?
Oh, that's like asking me to choose my favorite child, the classic. All the episodes that made into my book, I love them. But yeah, there are always episodes I feel more strongly about. A Question of Identity has so many great episodes in it that I love for different reasons or similar reasons. But yeah, I mean, where do I begin with that topic?
Unfair question.
But I mean, one of them called Person or Persons Unknown, also written by Beaumont, is about a guy who wakes up and he knows who he is, but everybody in his life, starting with his wife, doesn't know who he is. And again, that's such a base existential quandary. You feel you know who you are, but nobody else knows who you are. Or what happens when, if you remember that CeeLo Green song, Crazy, when other people think you're crazy, but you know you're not. And that is a very scary existential dread.
Yeah.
And Beaumont zeroed into it with that episode, Person or Persons Unknown. And so many of those other episodes about A Question of Identity deal with these very core issues of who you are, especially in relation to your reality.
And that really takes us into another subject that was getting more and more attention at the time that Serling was really conquering new territory here. The idea of there'll be robots in the future to take care of everything. And that humanity essentially will be kind of off to the side, that we are creating ourselves out of existence on a certain level. It, once again, talk about existential dread.
Well, look at what we're going through right now with AI technology replacing artists and writers. You know, there's a meme going around that said along the lines of, you know, I expected AI and robots to do the menial tasks of my life so I could create art and poetry. I didn't think AI was going to do the art and poetry, so I have to do the menial tasks. And anyway, Serling and the other Twilight Zone writers dealt with this concept of the obsolete man as one of the most recurring themes in Serling's career. I mean, one of those Emmy-winning TV series, two of them, Patterns and Requiem, are all about men who feel they're obsolete, they're over the hill, they can't compete. And this was a running theme then through the Twilight Zone in episodes like Obsolete Man, Burgess Meredith again, playing a librarian named Wordsworth. A little too on the nose there, Rod. Wordsworth, really? But yeah, he's a librarian named Wordsworth. Serling, I think, loved Dickens and always tried to give names that were very, very descriptive of the people who they were. But yeah, so then when he did Night Gallery in the 70s, one of the episodes that I think won him an Emmy with William Wyndham called They're Tearing Down Tim Riley's Bar was about a man who thinks he's over the hill. So this was a running theme throughout Serling's life. He was really an old soul in a young body that he would feel this way. And, you know, it was the loss of innocence in World War II that made him very nostalgic for a more innocent past and, you know, concerns like that, among many others, of course.
Which brings us to another iconic episode. The exact title I forget, but The Last Stop is Willoughby.
A Stop at Willoughby, yes.
Now, was that Gig Young that started that?
Gig Young was in Walking Distance. Stop at Willoughby was John Daly, the father of Tyne Daly, the actress.
Right.
But yes, sister episodes from the first season, Serling doppelgangers. In Willoughby, Daly plays a 36-year-old Madison Avenue ad exec who can't take the Madison Avenue rat race anymore. Serling was 36, I think, when he wrote it. In the 50s, when he lived in Westport, Connecticut, commuting into New York City to work on those live TV shows that won him those Emmys, Serling witnessed the pressures of all the men on the train with him back and forth. Back when there were no women on the trains, it was all men, right? And I'm sure he witnessed and felt that pressure to make the big money in New York City.
Yeah.
The guy on the episode comes back to a materialist shrew of a wife who is only with him for his ad agency salary. And then during his commuting trips, he drifts off into a dreamland. And he wakes up in what he thinks is this town called Willoughby, late 19th century idyllic thing out his train window. The train car has been transformed into a 19th century train. But he doesn't get off. As he's about to get off, he wakes up. And by the end of the episode, he's lost his job. His wife leaves him. He decides, next time I go to Willoughby in my dreams, I'm going to get off the train. And he does the next time at the end of the episode. And then you cut, classic Twilight Zone surprise ending. The guy's dead on the ground in the snow. And the conductor's there with a policeman. They're asking him, what happened? And the conductor goes, I don't know. He got up out of his seat, yelled something about Willoughby, and jumped off the train. So that was Serling writing about what he experienced, I believe, in the mid-50s, commuting in New York City and turning it into a Twilight Zone episode 5 or 6 years later.
I had forgotten the ending, but I remember the impact that the episode had on me. And
it's also Serling's favorite episode, and it is one of the most beloved episodes.
Oh, I can understand him feeling that way.
Yeah.
The fifth element is the time element.
Yes.
And doesn't that weave its way through so many episodes? We're getting some distortion here. Let's see if Race can get on it. Anyway, it does weave its way through so many episodes and remind us of our own mortality at the same time.
Well, you know, there's 14 episodes there under the time element. Serling described the Twilight Zone to be as timeless as infinity. And remember, I said Walking Distance is a time travel episode, and it's considered maybe the single greatest Twilight Zone episode of all time. But out of those 14 episodes that I chose, there were many more time travel episodes that I did not choose. But out of the 14 I chose, I think 11 of them are written by Serling. So time, again, because of his experience in the war, like a whole generation, the loss of innocence, the death that he witnessed, things that gave him nightmares and what we now call PTSD. Like, he channeled it into his writing like many writers did. J.D. Salinger and, Bud Schulberg and Norman Mailer, that generation that came out of World War II.
Kurt Vonnegut.
All of them. And other men, they say they never talked about their war experiences. They kept it inside. But Serling let it come out. And in the Twilight Zone, that's what a lot of these time travel episodes are about. But it was all different elements of time. His World War II themed episodes are in here. His episodes about the Holocaust, never before done on television, are in this. Science fiction time travel episodes are here. It's one of the most meaningful aspects of the Twilight Zone that I identified as the 5 themes of all of them, given the fact that, again, 12 or 13 of the episodes out of the 14 I chose. And let me just clarify, Peter, because we haven't really talked about this. There were 156 episodes of the Twilight Zone. I'm very critical about the things I love, whether it's comic book history. I'm a scholar of Bruce Springsteen's work. My next book for Bear Manor Media is about his unreleased material. Wow. I'm as critical as I am laudatory. And I think true fans or lovers of any artist's work have to be because not everything is equally great.
Yeah.
It's up to the critic and historian to make knowledgeable deductions and judgments based on the forensic evidence. So I'm very harsh when it comes to the Twilight Zone. Over half of the episodes I would call dogs. Now there are levels of dog, but I understand and I let them off easy because churning out anthology television back then, you know, when you have a sitcom or continuing characters or the same sets every week, you only have to concentrate on the story. Twilight Zone with anthology every week was a different world that you had to create.
Yeah.
That was difficult. So, you know, I give them a break. But here's the thing. I judge the 68 I chose out of 156 like a baseball hitter's percentage. That's like batting, I think, 435. Not bad. Serling wrote 92 or 3 of the 156 episodes. 41 of them are in my book. He wrote the best episodes. He wrote some of the worst. But 41 out of 93, that's like batting 465. So that's how I judge the episodes I chose as being representative of what I think are the greatest episodes. And my essays, in a sense, support my judgments if I've done my job well. But there's never been a consensus amongst fans or historians as to what the greatest episodes are. Because of the internet, we live in this democracy, in a sense, where everything is great. And an episode that I consider, you know, junk is somebody else's favorite episode. But it's the job, again, Peter, of art critics and historians to make consensuses about what the best is in a given body of work. Not everything is equally great. And that's what I've attempted to do by choosing these 68 episodes into these 5 themes I came up with as being representative of what you might call the Twilight Zone's greatest hits.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. If another Twilight Zone aficionado feels that an episode not in my book should have been in my book, well, my answer to them is write your own essay. Publish the more the merrier, because this is how consensuses are formed. You know, every year the AFI selects the best, 100 greatest movies. And, there are year-end lists. This is what critics and historians do.
Yeah.
They make consensuses. And I talk about this in the preface in my book. But that's what I've attempted to do with these Twilight Zone episodes. And it's an implicit gauntlet and a challenge that I'm throwing down to other Twilight Zone lovers, fans, scholars, that if you feel there are episodes, I know a guy named Rich Reese that I've known since 2008. He teaches English at Miami University, but he's a big Twilight Zone fan and scholar. He loves an episode called King 9 Shall Not Return, the first episode of season 2, which happened to be the first time Serling appeared on air in his familiar introductions. Not in the first season, just voiceover. But my friend Rich thinks this episode is the greatest episode of the Twilight Zone. I think it sucks. Now, I'm not being, facetious, but it's not in my book. But he has lectured on that episode. He loves King 9, and he has all the philosophical background to support it. So all I can say is touche. I wish everybody would write a treatise on the episode that's not in my book. But in the meantime, until that happens, get my book, because it is the best book about the Twilight Zone. There's nothing like my book.
And I'm going to add again that you walk that line. I've read a lot of film criticism, being a film lover since I was a kid, and studying film at Visual Arts as well.
Yeah.
But you walk that wonderful line between highly informed fandom and scholarship. You write out of a love for this material, and it's exciting to read it, because I'm an information geek, and on something this beloved, to learn new facts about something that you thought you knew about is, I think, just one of the most exciting and enjoyable parts of learning. Again, you were kind enough to send me the PDF, but being maybe you're psychic and can sense somehow that I'm a book person. Although I do tell people that's a green screen behind me to make me look intelligent. In fact, they are real books. And this is one I'm going to have to add to my library because there's no substitute for reading a book as opposed to a PDF on your screen, as good a PDF as it is. We are actually about to blow through our first hour. Amazing as that time element is. This is Peter Robbins, my special guest, Arlen Schumer. The show is Meanwhile Here on Earth. We'll be back in 4 minutes. Stay with us.
The UNX Network classes and workshops are enrolling now for 2025. If you're interested in psychic protection, chakra balancing, dowsing, or perhaps healing with sound and music, visit unxnetwork.com to see our complete series of live and on-demand classes and workshops hosted by the one and only Margie K. For example, in January 2025, you could spend 4 Saturdays with Margie for her exclusive live remote viewing workshop. Margie K is one of the most accomplished remote viewers in the world, and she will share her secrets and totally unique methods in this course. Some courses are open now. Seating is limited for these live courses, so register now at unxnetwork.com. UNX members use promo code XMEM for an additional 15% discount.
Unlock the mysteries of the spirit realm with the new book, Meeting Wallace. In this channeled work by renowned psychic medium Larry Costa, the reader will delve into the profound wisdom of his spirit guide, Wallace. Together, they share the transformative journey of harnessing psychic powers from the celestial plane. Discover the extraordinary psychic gifts that have empowered Larry on his path and immerse yourself in a thought-provoking and awe-inspiring read. Meeting Wallace is a groundbreaking endeavor, and it is a perspective seen through the eyes of a spirit guide. Discover the wisdom of the spirit realm alongside actual photographs of ghosts and spirit guides. Get the book Meeting Wallace by Larry Costa at Amazon.com. This is Margie K, and I'd like to say thank you to all of our KUNX show hosts, staff, listeners, and viewers for making us number 1 on Paranormal Talk Radio.
Ray Hobbs here for the UNX Network as we present a health and wellness, spiritually based brand of hemp-derived CBD products made by Hopewell Farm in Harrogate, Tennessee. They apply Cathara energy work with all of their plants and products. All of their products are made in small batches and third-party lab tested for potency and legal THC levels with 6 strengths of 1 ounce oil to choose from. Know what you're buying and get what you pay for from Hopewell Farm. Applied directly to a specific area, Hopewell Farms Topical Salve. It comes in 1 ounce and half-ounce sizes made with all natural ingredients. And from now until January 2nd, use promo code KUNX Holiday for an additional 15% off all CBD products. Find the Hopewell Farm link and coupon code on the UNX Network website at unxnetwork.com. That's unxnetwork.com. Promo code KUNX Holiday.
And we are back. Meanwhile, Here on Earth is the show. Peter Robbins, your host, and my special guest tonight, Arlen Schumer. And we are going to stick with the Twilight Zone a bit longer before we move on to other matters. I just wanted to give folks a look at a bit more of the book because, again, it's so wonderfully laid out. Creativity kind of grows on itself in a way. And I look forward to physically turning the pages. It brings us back there in so many ways. Yeesh.
I was
Also,
the original title of the episode, Eye of the Beholder, The Private World of Darkness.
yeesh. It's, again, such a mixture of shots from the show, production photographs,
Right.
ephemera from the time.
Yeah.
If you weren't alive then, as many folks weren't, it's a wonderful opportunity to get a deeper sense of the show.
Spreads, the Willoughby spread.
Ooh.
That's a technique in graphic design called ghosting. When you take a usually black and white image and you gray it back so that you can still read the black type that's superimposed over the image. So it's called ghosting an image. And I thought for subject matter like the Twilight Zone, which is often with ghostly concerns, and plus because it's a black and white show, graying back a black and white image makes perfect visual sense for the episode itself.
It works great and never better than on page 82 to 83. This one was an absolute showstopper for me.
Yeah, and that's my favorite spread. It's the episode called 22 about a woman in a hospital that has a recurring nightmare that she goes down to the basement hospital morgue. And this woman, the woman in the image here, appears startlingly opening the door, and she says the famous line, "Room for one more, honey," which again is just one of those phrases. The first time you've heard it, especially as a kid, it just burns its way into your brain. Room for one more. And they become pop culture catchphrases. That's the Twilight Zone. But that spread in which I ghosted her image back, that's Arlen Sachs. I think her married name was Arlene Martell. But she played the very first T'Pring on Star Trek, the Amok episode.
Okay.
Episode of season 2. And she was also in a famous Outer Limits episode, Demon with a Glass Hand, I think. But she looks so otherworldly and almost exotic. Again, it's what makes the Twilight Zone timeless. It doesn't look dated. The true test of a work of art, it has to be of its time, but timeless.
Yes.
When you look at Arlen Sachs as the morgue nurse, she's just perfect. And again, she's immortal. And she looks like the angel of death. She's beautiful, but she's the angel of death.
And the angel of death comes up a number of times in episodes in very different incarnations. What I want to do is just have some fun here and go to some of these perfectly laid out. What you do here is you boil it down to the epitome of an image regarding the show, the eternal typeface that we will always associate. And what's the face again?
Bernhard Modern.
Love it. When I saw this, I knew, like anybody in growing up when I did, Jonathan Winters was a comic and a very manic comic.
Yeah.
It wasn't until seeing him as a serious actor.
Well, again, Sterling was ahead of his time. Before this episode, he cast Art Carney, known as being Ed Norton, as Santa Claus, really the first bad Santa, in a Twilight Zone Christmas episode that aired in 1960 in the season 2 of the Twilight Zone, Night of the Meek. So Sterling, again, by casting comedians in dramatic roles, which is done all the time now, Sterling, again, was in the vanguard of that, like he was in the vanguard of diversity casting, like we discussed earlier.
Also, in the Game of Pool episode, it was one of a number of episodes where the wonderful actor that most of us associate with the long-running beloved show The Odd Couple, based on Neil Simon's play, was cast in a number of ways, and giving him an opportunity to show range that most of us didn't associate with him from that, again, if we just knew him as Oscar Madison.
But
yes.
You're looking back on The Twilight Zone if you already know Klugman in The Odd Couple.
Good point. Right, of course. Good point.
Klugman was a dramatic actor in 12 Angry Men before The Twilight Zone.
Of course.
And his comedian aspect with Odd Couple came after. So what you just said is really only applicable to newbies to The Twilight Zone who only know Klugman as a comedian.
Yeah.
Then you see him in these dramatic roles. But back then, that's not what we were talking about. But like I said, people like Art Carney and Jonathan Winters were comedians given a chance to show their dramatic acting chops, which again has become in the 21st century pretty commonplace that all comedians, it's like a rite they have to go through, is to do a dramatic role that shows their ability to, quote, act.
Yeah. Also,
comic movies never win Oscars. For whatever reason, comedy films, aren't considered great films. Am I right about that? I don't think they've ever won the Oscar for Best Picture. Maybe I'm wrong. But in general, that's the idea behind comedians wanting to act dramatically.
Yeah. I also think, this episode is an epitome also of treatments of the afterlife, whether it be heaven, hell, or purgatory. We have a number of examples. This one begins in the afterlife. We have here the greatest pool player of all time returning to play a challenger who would have loved to have played him in real life, played by Klugman. But that otherworldly beginning and original notions of, again, what happens after we die. This is another episode that is a play on the afterlife as far as I was concerned, and one that I remember as a kid. We have our protagonist here who is an arch, a hoodlum. And he is wined and dined, so to say, by our genial host to such a degree in Las Vegas where everything he does works out great. Everything he wants, he gets. And at a certain point, he'd like, things to be a little more action-oriented. And again, spoiler alert, although I guess it's more than 50 years out there, so some folks do know the ending, that he is not where he thinks he is. He is in hell. A very clever interpretation of it. And of course, another twist ending that left me gasping as a kid. Again, one of the most memorable child performances, and talk about amping up the anxiety, the fear, if you allow yourself to experience it, the terror, with such a minimum of prop work or effects. The Jack in the Box and the spring coming out of the Jack in the Box, and then the head on the spring. That's like a $5 special effect, but I'll never forget it. And the idea, the word cornfield has never been quite the same to me. Wishing somebody out into the cornfield, once again, it kind of transcended television and became a real place in the mindset. Again, we talked about it already, but yes, of course, not Gig Young. That longing for a simpler reality. And years before he became the iconic, really rewrote the whole police show genre. Telly Savalas was a wonderful bad guy in Living Doll. A reminder, never treat your children's toys harshly. Can you tell us about this episode? The moment I saw that image, it came back to me. But can you share with us what makes that episode special for you?
Well, Nick of Time, written by Richard Matheson, starring William Shatner in two pre-Star Trek episodes. That is a bobbing little totem on top of a fortune-telling machine in a luncheonette, similar to the way you'd have jukeboxes in a luncheonette booth. And it just gives little aphorisms when you put in a penny. And it's about a couple, William Shatner and his wife, that wander into this luncheonette and start feeding this machine, which eventually starts dictating their lives and the decisions they make. And it's really the ultimate science versus superstition episode, because it's all about whether you would believe, like people do, in seers and fortune tellers and psychics and tarot card readers. All stuff that Richard Matheson, the writer, all hated as superstition that pulled modern man down. And Serling described the Twilight Zone as the land that lies between science and superstition. And that's why Nick of Time and that little devil head is one of the great little icons of the Twilight Zone.
It really is. And again, for anybody that discovered William Shatner with the beginnings of Star Trek, this is a wonderful little iconic appearance. And was it the Terror at 20,000 feet?
Nightmare at 20,000 feet.
Oh,
by Matheson.
Oh, mama. Another one of the greatest episodes of all time, and enough to really raise the hair on the back of a kid's neck. I'll tell you what.
Adult.
I don't think I've ever flown and been had my window on a wing where I haven't thought of it.
Well, this is an example of a suburban nightmare of being on a plane, so to speak.
And nobody believes you.
Out on the wing that only you see. Exactly. So it has so many of those Twilight Zone elements that make for a great episode. Now, this is an ironic one, because the monster, the gremlin on the wing, is one of the worst special effects in the Twilight Zone's history. Not special effects, really makeup and costume. Looks like a furry ape. And when he bends down to rip off the fuselage of the wing, you can see the soles of his feet are like the rubber soles that you would get in a store-bought ape costume. Richard Matheson never forgave Twilight Zone for that.
No.
A decade and a half later, 2 decades later, he got to redo it with John Lithgow in Twilight Zone, the movie, the Spielberg anthology, directed by George Miller from Road Warrior. It's considered the best of those 4 episodes.
Yeah.
But, notwithstanding, the very first time Shatner pulls open the curtain of the airplane window and you see that gremlin right up on the glass, that is what I would call a kind of Serling tapping into these post-war American deep-seated fears that everybody can identify with. And if you've seen that episode, when you're on a train or a plane and you go to open up the window, you always think about that episode, because that's the greatness of the Twilight Zone, that it tapped into what I call this kind of psycho-American Gothic. These very American settings, a bus station in which a woman sees an exact duplicate of herself.
Yeah.
Serling came up with that episode called Mirror Image because he was in a bus station in California and he saw a man on the opposite end of the station who he thought looked exactly like him and was dressed like him. And that birthed this Twilight Zone episode, which is, again, a very existential. This idea of seeing a duplicate of yourself not only taps into science fiction lore, because there have been many science fiction stories about duplicates from another dimension. Again, Serling didn't invent it, but he brought it to American television, treated it seriously.
He sure
That
did.
episode, Mirror Image, is in my top 5. This is a George Clayton Johnson episode, along with the game of pool. Those 2 episodes of his that I write about in my book, with the young Robert Redford.
Yes.
And, spoiler alert, Mr. Death.
Yes. Yes. Well, what can I say? I mean, for me, watching that episode as a kid, and it stuck in my mind because who thinks of Death as, a handsome wasp guy? It's some, crone with
flipping around a cliche, basically.
Yeah.
And that's how you reinvent a cliche, is by turning it on its head and making Death not be a traditional spooky with the cloak and the scythe. That was the traditional image of Death.
There was a tremendous poignancy to that episode because Death is being confronted by an older woman in her apartment who is very afraid. And the fact that he appears at first as a police officer, and there's a kindness to him. It's your time, basically. Talk about juxtaposition. It really rattled my little personal cage as a kid, and that realization later in life of, oh, there's that guy, that actor whose name I know now, who I first saw when I was a kid on The Twilight Zone. We were introduced to quite a number of great players, no question. Jesus. Please remind me quickly, who was the star of this episode?
Cliff Robertson, one of the great.
Oh, geez, of course. And another theme that has been, in some cases done to death, pun intended, in American popular horror film making. But there is something about a ventriloquist dummy that gives a lot of us the creeps, and never creepier than in that episode where, he loses himself. Who's the master? Who's the puppet? This. Very much, kind of a similar theme to Nothing in the Dark, in that we have somebody whose time has come and Death is being very patient, and once again throwing it on its head with another incredibly attractive actor, in this case actress. And I remember, she's too young, you can't take her, and just the repetition of that same person wherever she goes. So little needed to be done to create so much in one's imagination. It's part of the genius of the whole series that all these years later, we can re-enjoy these episodes or contemplating them in our heads, or like a great piece of literature, read it at different times in our life and get different things from it. I'm all jacked up to start watching these all again from the beginning. Again, as far as television innovation goes, not only was this episode great creative television at a time when everybody was talking a lot, and sometimes too much to each other, to have a full commercial 26 minutes where occasionally the actor will make a sound, and then at the end, of course, without giving this one away because it really is precious, we find out about the invaders themselves that she has managed to subdue. A perfect space age tale, early space exploration tale, fear of aliens. It brought it all together brilliantly with Agnes Moorehead, an Academy Award-winning actress, doing a job on television that actors very rarely get a chance to do. Your thoughts on this particular episode, Arlen?
Well, I described her performance as mimetic, like a mime.
Ooh.
When I interviewed Douglas Hayes, the director of that episode, and I told him that, I said her performance is like mimetic. He goes, Arlen, did you know that Agnes Moorehead had studied with the great mime Marcel Marceau before she did that role? And I'm like, wow.
No idea.
I had just made that observation, so I'll always remember that. That was a great compliment from the great director Douglas Hayes. He also did Eye of the Beholder. He did the After Hours where the mannequins come to life. One of the great Identity episodes.
Yeah,
and
that was intense. Jean Marsh, who many of us met years after this, when she started to become a very well-known actress and was a star or co-star of a number of English films. And
it was upstairs, downstairs on PBS.
There you go, Masterpiece Theater. And here was a complete unknown, especially in America. Another one that, for me, the poignancy of the beauty of the physical actor and the rawness of the story of her playing a android, a robot, in a future where men, very lonely men, are involved in mining and other operations on Mars and other bodies out there, and kind of an old-fashioned arranged marriage. It brought together a very 19th and even earlier century kind of story with a story set well in the future, and had so much emotion to it. Was it George Kennedy who played opposite her?
Jack Warden.
There you go. A great actor. And again, as a kid watching it, all of those feelings of more traditional romances going through your head and thinking, boy, if I ever, grow up in a world with robots, I hope they're this attractive. Who wrote this episode?
Serling.
Way to go, Ron. And one we were discussing before, again, special effects that are so embarrassing, especially to an audience of sophisticated viewers who are used to special effects. However, the power of the drama was so compelling that, you know what? It didn't really matter. It was, for me, like in the extraordinary film about Betty and Barney Hill, made in the mid-'70s, I think by CBS for television, the Incident at Exeter film, which was a powerhouse with James Earl Jones and she's still around, was doing Broadway when she was 90, Estelle Parsons. Those aliens are incredibly embarrassing. They're little people with big masks on their heads. But once again, it didn't matter. We all got this episode for what it was. And those images stay with us. Again, the power of a good story to do better than a prop. No question about it. The ultimate suburban nightmare, and one of the most powerful human episodes. I think it's almost in a class by itself. Can you compare this to any other episode? It brought together the Cold War, fear of the unknown, aliens, human manipulation, insecurities. This was a masterpiece.
Are you asking me a question?
Yeah. Your thoughts on this episode, Arlen?
You pretty much said it all, Peter.
Our two leads there both went on to distinguished careers. And I'm forgetting the name of the actor on the left.
Claude Akins.
Okay. He, I guess, really within a year of this, was a star in Inherit the Wind, a powerful film about the Scopes monkey trial. And again, that idea of what these fallout shelters meant to us, as well as this idea of people being manipulated Just a powerhouse of an episode. We talked about this one, but not much. Again, like most kids, I grew up with Art Carney. I only knew him as a comic and as the foil and sidekick for Jackie Gleason in The Honeymooners. But here, he's granted a wish to not be an average kind of failure schnook, but to do some good in his world. Tell us about this episode and why you singled it out.
Well, it's one of the most beloved episodes because, of course, it's the Christmas themed episode. It's beloved because we all love Art Carney as Ed Norton, but to see him in a dramatic role. And because it's the classic thing of what if I could become Santa Claus? You know, Miracle on 34th Street was about Santa Claus becoming real.
Yeah.
But Serling inverted that by having somebody real become Santa Claus, if only for a night. But at the end of the episode, of course, he actually goes off with a little elf in a sleigh at the end. So I think it's beloved because it's, you know, the Christmas episode of The Twilight Zone. And Serling, though raised Jewish, he loved Christmas like a lot of American Jews who suffer what I call Christmas envy. And he treated Christmas as this wondrous spirit of the season, like a secular holiday, more like Thanksgiving. And out of that spirit, he wrote that episode. And it was never one of my favorite personally, but I put it in the book because there was a lot about that episode worth writing about. And, you know, I knew I had to put that episode in because I just knew so many people, you know, loved it. And I gave it its place in the book.
I'm remembering an episode now that I've seen a number of times, and that's particularly poignant for me. Ed Wynn was one of my grandfather's favorite actors, and more contemporary audiences, although he's gone now for years. Keenan Wynn was a wonderful actor and a major component in Dr. Strangelove. Bat Guano, Major Bat Guano, as I recall. And the episode with Keenan Wynn, where he has to make a big pitch, where much like Carney.
That's Ed Wynn. Keenan Wynn was in a different Twilight Zone episode called A World of Its Own.
I meant Ed, of course, who started out in vaudeville and silent films and brought a great poignancy and just a tremendous.
I didn't include that episode in my book, but the one with Keenan Wynn is in my book.
Ah, okay. The one with Ed Wynn, once again, a regular guy has a chance to do something extraordinary, but it also combines it yet once again with another incarnation of the Angel of Death.
Right, played by Murray Hamilton, who would later be the great mayor of Jaws. Also, he's the husband of Mrs. Robinson. He's Mr. Robinson, Murray Hamilton. Those are his three pop culture credentials.
I love it.
Zone as Mr. Death, Mr. Robinson, and the mayor in Jaws.
It's wonderful. My sister Helen used to have a great phrase when we'd be watching a show or a movie and all of a sudden a character would appear that was iconically part of some other part of our television or film reality. Was they had fallen through from this one. Again, in a class by itself, as far as I'm concerned, without spoiling it by giving the ending, we have a situation which has been wonderfully dealt with in some science fiction classics over the years of the Earth is coming to an end and we've got to get out of here. And these three guys and Fritz Weaver on the left, the best known of them, do escape, but it's got such a stellar surprise ending. And there's no way we could have seen it coming. And at the same time, oh, sure, I can buy that. I'll leave that episode alone and go right to one that in the world of UFO studies is, to put it mildly, iconic. Please talk about this episode. I'd like to hear you discuss it, because I'm mostly used to discussing it with people who are, in the world of UFO studies.
Well, To Serve Man is one of the, again, most remembered and I guess beloved Twilight Zone episodes. It's what I call a punchline episode. It really comes down to a pun on the phrase "to serve man." Yeah, spoiler alert, it's a cookbook. Again, it's not, in my personal top 10 or 25 or maybe even 50. But I put it in the book because there's a lot to discuss about the concept of benevolent aliens coming to Earth like Greeks bearing gifts, and whether we trust them or not. And that's run through science fiction. And we're still discussing that with aliens today. Are they watching us? Are they manipulating us?
Yes.
Are they? Look, there's whole radio networks where you're discussing this.
That's right.
It's funny. The phrase paranormal itself, Twilight Zone introduced the paranormal to American pop culture at that time. That was not used to seeing that. Again, it was only in science fiction literature, which was this cloistered, little reading form. Yeah. But I lost my train of thought. What was I just saying? Man, I go off on so many tangents.
He made it mainstream. Science fiction was no longer relegated.
I was going to say something.
It may well come back.
About To Serve Man. So, that's an adaptation by Serling of a short story by Damon Knight. And one of the examples I do in the book is, the Canamites were, posing as benevolent aliens. And of course, they're there just to eat us. But, in a way, this is the way we thought of aliens back then. First, we were scared of them. Then after Close Encounters, we became more embracing of them. Now I think we're back to being a little scared of them. What's his name? Stephen Hawking, I think in 2015, made a speech somewhere where he said, aliens are so far beyond us that, they might treat us just like bugs, like microscopic nothings. Or, I end my essay on To Serve Man with, or they might think of us as food. And that's why To Serve Man still has that timeliness. But it comes down to a pun, That's why people remember that episode.
It's true. And it was a lot of fun. Plus again, an old-fashioned dynamic tension. Meanwhile, in the basement of the UN, the translators are working away. We have the title of the book, To Serve Man. What could be better? Until we learn the nature of the book at the end. Serling himself had, I think, a very happy family life. 2 kids, a wife that loved him very much, and one shot that I particularly like of them.
Do you want me to say something?
And if you'd like, I some insight into the man himself.
Peter, you're the interviewer.
Yeah, it's true. As far as working with his daughter, was it, or did you work with Carol, his wife?
Well, it's funny. On my first book, I worked with Carol Serling when she was alive. But for this book, I had met Anne Serling, one of his 2 daughters, at a Serling convention in Binghamton in 2008, where I delivered my Twilight Zone kind of multimedia lecture that I still do in videos. You can see it posted on my website. But when it was over, which I treat Serling as pretty much like God, Anne Serling, who I had never met, came down the aisle with tears in her eyes, thanking me for what a beautiful job I had done honoring her father. And then I saw her again in 2013 at a Serling Symposium in LA, in which I delivered a lecture there. And we were talking, and I mentioned that I didn't have a father growing up. My mother was a widow. My father died when I was 4 months old. And my brother and I herself didn't remarry till I was 17.
Wow.
But I think I found my father figures in the American pop culture I grew up with, the superheroes in the comic books I was reading, Serling on television. Eventually Bruce Springsteen became a kind of a father figure. I worked for Neil Adams, one of the gods of comic book art in the late 60s and 70s, and I got to work for him. So he was a bit of a father figure. So I've self-analyzed my life and career as a search for these proxy father figures. And the works I've done on the Twilight Zone, especially my new book, are, I imagine, how a son might treat his father's legacy if his father was Rod Serling. And I used to joke, I'm the son Rod Serling never had. His two daughters are a couple of years older than me, but I'm treating Serling and the Twilight Zone, which I call the father of American popular culture, Peter. I know it sounds grandiose, but if you name any modern science fiction, fantasy, or horror product, I can trace it back to Serling and the Twilight Zone in less than 6 degrees of Serling, as I call it. Pun on 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. But I truly believe that because, Stephen King, in his 1983 nonfiction overview of the science fiction, fantasy, and horror fields called Dance Macabre, he has a whole chapter devoted to the Twilight Zone.
I wasn't aware of that.
He basically says that he was a teenager when the Twilight Zone debuted. And for him and his generation, and I'm paraphrasing what King wrote, the Twilight Zone and Serling lit the sparks of their imaginations that opened up a world of possibilities that had never existed before. And who is his generation? George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, James Cameron, Ridley Scott, David Lynch, are all of our modern creators of American science fiction, fantasy, and horror. All are Serling's metaphorical children. He died in 1975, Peter. Think about that year. Jaws debuted. Carrie, the first Stephen King movie, comes out. Serling died just as his metaphorical children were coming to the fore. Had he lived only 5 years longer, he would have seen the fruits of the Twilight Zone, because when he died, he talked about the Twilight Zone very dismissively. He said, yeah, we had some turkeys and we had some episodes I was proud of, but that was about it. He didn't live long enough to see the tremendous influence. Chris Carter of the X-Files.
Yeah.
Vince Gilligan, when Breaking Bad ended, Peter, and it was being called by critics one of the greatest TV shows of all time, TV Guide interviewed Gilligan and asked him, how do you want your show to be remembered since critics are calling it one of the best TV shows of all time? And Gilligan said, if people in the future will talk about my show the way we talk now about the Twilight Zone,
wow,
I'll die a happy boy, or whatever he said.
Boy.
But that is the esteem and the impact that the Twilight Zone has had. So when I say it's the father of American popular culture, I say it in the beginning of my book, in the preface, and it's the very last sentence in my book. And the essays in between on those 68 episodes and their tributaries that went out and influenced an entire generation to create our modern American popular culture of science fiction, fantasy, and horror. That's why it's the father of American popular culture. And I make my case in those essays, and it's up to you, the reader, to judge for yourself. if by making a claim as bold as that,
Yeah.
whether I backed it up.
And I, again, encourage you to get out there and read this book. It really is special, whether or not you're a fan from the get-go or more newly introduced to it, or, growing up with the reruns. Right now, we're still some way to go, but let us know, what is your website for starters?
Okay, so it's basically my name, arlenschumer.com, and you'll see subpages on the Twilight Zone, on the book, comic book history, Bruce Springsteen, my illustration works,
Great.
the events that I do, the lectures and webinars, link to my YouTube and Vimeo channel, where you can see videos of over 100 of my past pop culture history lectures and webinars. So my whole life is on my website, but you can order a signed hardcover in time for the holidays of both my Twilight Zone book and, since Visions is out of print, my beautiful book about comic book history,
Whoa.
The Silver Age of comic book art. $50 each, post-paid. End of shameless plug, department.
Not a, you've earned the right.
I hope
No, you definitely have. We don't have that much more time left, but I'd like to shift gears here, although I think I could talk with you about the Twilight Zone for quite a number of shows in a row.
Are you kidding me?
Well, as to paraphrase Arnold Schwarzenegger, you'll be back.
I'll be back.
The world of comics. And let's quickly establish the categories: the Golden Age, the Silver Age. What drew you to this? Was the thing that drew you to the Silver Age was that those were the generation of comics that you were growing up with?
Well, of course, every person is influenced by the music and the art and the movies and the culture of their youth. It's what you get hooked into that often dictates the course of your life. Guys like Keith Richards, when they heard whatever, that blues note by Robert Johnson, that was it. People who saw Elvis, people who saw, the Beatles. I mean, it's what you see usually as a kid that ends up, influencing you often for the rest of your life. And yeah, those images I saw and the comic books that I was quote reading comic books before I learned how to read in school. I remember looking at the pictures and trying to sound out, the words. But I went to summer camp very early in life because my mother was a widow. She was told, me and my brother needed some male influence when we were very young. So we were sent to 2 months of sleepaway camp when I was like 5, 6, 7 years old, those 3 years. But in summer camp in those days, the bunks were strewn with comic books. There were Archies. There were all different kinds, but most of them were the DC and Marvel superhero books of the 1960s. And I can still remember the first comic book I held in my hand. I was drawn to, I guess, the colors, and the superheroes were very seductive, I guess. And I didn't read children's books as a kid. I don't have any memory of Dr. Seuss and all that, the Disney stuff. I remember comic books and television as the two greatest influences in my early pop culture life, and eventually movies, of course. But movies first seen on television before you go to the movie theater. But yeah, comic books became my first visual source of love, and starting to draw and imitating the artists. I mean, a whole generation of professionals, not just comic book artists, but art directors, movie directors even, have been influenced by the comics of the 1960s, known as the Silver Age, as opposed to the 30s and 40s when comic books and superheroes started, called the Golden Age. So there had been books about the Golden Age up the wazoo. My whole library is filled with them. But there was never a book about the Silver Age, and there was never a history book about the great artwork in comics. Most comic book history books were text heavy with little reproductions. Now, I became an artist because of the comic book art. You can see some of it right behind me. Yeah. But a whole generation did. And I'm thinking, where is the book about the art? Well, you know what they say, if you want something done right, you got to do it yourself. My book to date is the only book that's about the great artwork. And what I do is I take out the original word balloons and I put the artist talking about the artwork.
Brilliant.
So you read my book like a giant comic book, but it's an art book and it's a history book as well, because it's also about the 1960s and how the comic art reflected the decade. You can see about Vietnam down below there, the Marvel comics of the 60s. Look at how Thor was used on the acid test poster and Hulk on Rolling Stone. So again, there are other books about comic book history, but there is literally no other book like my book, because this is the only book about the art. It's not the Silver Age of comic books. It's the Silver Age of comic book art. And I maintain that our modern directors like Spielberg and Lucas trying to make fantasy real is what the trajectory of the Silver Age of comic book art was about, was making the characters and the superheroes more real. Neil Adams, who finishes the book, had a photorealistic drawing style. And he said, if superheroes really existed, they would look like the way I draw them. Our modern special effects and fantasy creators are trying to make fantasy look real. And I believe that an artist like Neil Adams in the late 60s, when the Spielbergs and the Lucases were just beginning to rise to the fore, were influenced by what Neil Adams was doing on the comic book page in making the world of superheroes look and feel real. And they would eventually bring that, along with the computer graphics that eventually caught up with what used to only be done in comic books, can now be done on the computer.
Again, this book, like your Twilight Zone book, looks beautifully laid out with great production values. Can I ask, was the Silver Age book printed in America?
No, all art books are printed overseas because of the costs.
I figured.
There's still great printers in America, but most full-color art books are printed in the East, Japan, China, whatever. It's just like all the animation of these shows on TV they're laid out and storyboarded in America and designed, but the actual animated rendering, which is very time-consuming and still calls for a lot of human labor, that's all done in the East.
What was the first comic book that you remember reading?
It was a Superman annual, meaning once a year, 25-cent, 80-page giant, as they were called. From 1963, which was the 25th anniversary of Superman, began in 1938. So it was the silver anniversary, and there was an incredibly drawn statue, a silver statue of Superman on the cover of this annual that looked three-dimensionally real, because the artists used what are called wash tones to make the silver look like silver on a two-dimensional four-color press printed page. But I remember staring at that cover in summer camp as, along with the Twilight Zone eyeball, that comic book cover is my first, I think, full-color visual image I can recall holding in my hands and having it resonate with me. And that began a love affair with comic book art and comic books and superheroes that I have to this day.
You know, as a passionate historian, amateur, but lifelong, of New York City, my hometown, and where I worked for years as a walking tour guide, that realization, I'm sure I read it somewhere, but then walking into Times Square and standing at, I guess, 44th Street or so, and looking across at the Paramount building from 1922, which has a huge globe on top and a clock. My literary agent had his office in that building for years, and realizing that was the artist, Joe, what's his name, the original Superman artist. that was the building that the Daily Planet was based on. And it has never been less than thrilling on a certain level to walk by it. I even got to go out on the balconies below the clock at one point on a New Year's Eve when we were couldn't get out, but basically stayed there until 3 a.m.
One of my webinar videos on my YouTube channel is called New York Comics, where I do a history of comics, starting with comic strips and leading into comic books that had New York City as not only a background, but practically a character. The very first comic strip in America is called The Yellow Kid, and that took place in the slums of New York City in 1895 or so. So right from the beginning, New York City was tied in with the very medium itself.
Yeah.
And of course, Gotham City and Metropolis are based on New York.
You bet.
And then, into modern times. So I do a whole webinar on that, and you can watch the video on my YouTube channel, linked from my website.
I think overall, would you say comic book art is up there with jazz in an innately American art form?
Absolutely.
I mean, it didn't start here necessarily. And the very first graphic novel, I think, was published in Germany in about 1927 or so, but Japan, America, that comic book art really has been a wonderful goodwill ambassador for this country, like jazz, and a truly innate American art form, especially as we're talking about it here from what I'll call the classics. As a little kid growing up, the only alien that I knew about was Superman. And, he came from outer space in his little rocket ship. They look very human. You can't tell them apart from, us human beings. But how it all goes back to the origin, so to say. And I'm wondering if Rod Serling was a comic book reader as a kid.
Well, he was in World War II, where all the servicemen read comic books. And I make it a point to point out that one of his greatest episodes of The Twilight Zone, Eye the Beholder with the pig faces, comes out of the same plot in an EC science fiction comic book 7 years earlier in 1953 called The Ugly One. And even though it's not the same exact story, it's basically the same story as Eye the Beholder. Now, Serling claimed he came up with the idea for Eye the Beholder while laying awake at night in his bed looking off into the darkness. I think he was having a sense memory without realizing it from an EC science fiction comic book he read, because, again, Serling loved science fiction, pulp novels.
Yeah.
He liked mainstream pop, American culture, movies, everything. So I'm sure he loved comic books as well. And the fact that The Ugly One is Eye of the Beholder is kind of exhibit A in my claim.
Arlen, are you working on a new project right now that you can tell us about?
Well, my next book for Bear Manor Media is about Bruce Springsteen and his volume of unreleased material that I've written essays about that kind of form a parallel history of Springsteen adjacent to his released material, but differing in significant ways. And if it's possible, maybe even being better in some ways. And even though, again, I have shelves of books about Bruce Springsteen, nobody's written about this aspect of his career as I have. It's called Brilliant Disguise, Bruce Springsteen's Greatest Hits You've Never Heard. That'll be out next fall of 2025 in time to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Born to Run, his breakthrough album and song. I'll be moderating a panel. I live here in Westport, Connecticut, and there's a great library. And I'll be moderating a panel for their spring musical festival on the 50th anniversary of Born to Run in the first week of April. So that's what's coming up. I have a Twilight Zone screening and book signing in New York City in January.
Where?
The 25th at the Triad Theater, a little cabaret theater on the Upper West Side. I show the episode Willoughby and how it influenced the John Cheever short story, The Swimmer, made into this fabulous cult film with Burt Lancaster. And in my in-between introductions and outros, I basically connect all of those three things and how they influenced each other. And I'll be signing books as well. So when I get that information up on my website, it'll be in my events blog. But that'll be January 25th. So that's what's coming up for me.
Folks can also follow you on Facebook. And
I'm on Instagram. I'm on Blue Sky Social, no more X. And but yeah, I'm mostly on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky Social, LinkedIn. I run a Twilight Zone group on LinkedIn that I urge everybody to join. And yeah, that's pretty much where you can find me. I run 3 comic book history groups on Facebook. One about the Silver Age, one dedicated to Jack Kirby's work, and one dedicated to Neil Adams' work.
And
so
that is the perfect note for us to go out on, because we are out of time. Arlen Schumer, a true pleasure from beginning to end. Take care. We will stay in touch. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Arlen Schumer, and see you next week.